Hello and welcome back. This is day 2 of the conference and we're just about to start session 6. We have 7 participants and they all have something in common. They all work for the United Nations. That is because the topic for this session is interventions by the UN. Let me introduce to you the moderator, Ms. Isabel Kempf, Head of Bonn Office and Senior Research Coordinator at United Nations Research Institute for Social Development. We also have 6 presenters. Mr. Christopher Tungri, Team Leader of Partnership and Program at United Nations Development Program, Africa Borderlands Center, Nairobi, Kenya. We also have Celia Hawley, Program Manager at United Nations Environment Program and EU Climate Change and Security Program. Ms. Kaori Kawakami, Chief of Emergency Preparedness and Response Unit, Culture and Emergencies Entity, Culture Sector, United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. We also have Dr. Amado Philip DeAndre, Regional Representative of United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. Mr. Marcelo Notariani, International Hospitality and Sustainable Tourism Expert with the United Nations World Tourism Organization. Lastly, we have Ms. Abigail Hartley, Chief of Policy, Advocacy, Public Information and Resource Mobilization at United Nations Mine Action Service. If you're ready, I'm going to hand over the mic to Ms. Isabel Kempf. Are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Glad
Thank you very much. Great. So welcome everyone to the 6th session of DEEPEN, of the DEEPEN conference. This session is on interventions by the United Nations. I'm very happy to moderate the session because I have worked myself as a senior human rights advisor for the African Great Lakes Peace Process, where I worked on a wide spectrum of transborder issues, including judicial cooperation, joint border posts and controls, the question of impunity, sexual violence, and also trafficking of natural resources. So I'm very well acquainted with this topic, and I'm very looking forward to share the presentations by this interesting panelists with you today. I would also like to say thank you to the organizers, UNRISD and People for Earth, who have organized this conference with support from Gangwon provincial government and the Cheorwon county government of the Republic of Korea. Thanks so much. So in this session, what are we going to look at? We are looking at a few key questions. The first one is, which major interventions have UN agencies undertaken to address issues related to peacemaking in Borderlands? Number 2 is, what are the opportunities and challenges of these interventions by the UN system? Number 3 is about lessons that can be learned to maximize impacts of UN interventions on the SDGs related to the environment, development, and peacemaking in Borderlands. And we would like to discuss also a number of issues, which are projects related to the issues of environment, development, peacemaking in border areas. And as you see, I'm joined here today by a fantastic group of panelists, they will all share their insights, reflections, and their life experiences. Before we start, I would like to make a few announcements. One is that this session will be recorded and live streamed via the YouTube channel so that it will remain available afterwards. And you'll see that we have enabled the comment section on the YouTube live channel so that you can post your questions there. So without much ado, I would like to now introduce Christopher Tungri, who is leading the partnerships and program section of the UNDP Africa Borderlands Center in Nairobi. He's a dear friend and colleague. So yes, we are really very much looking forward to his presentation because Christopher has worked for many years on crisis prevention, also for the UNDP Crisis Bureau in New York. So Christopher, we are looking forward to your presentation. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Isabel. Good morning to colleagues like Abigail joining us from the Americas, and good afternoon and good evening to the rest. I wanted to talk about three different things today in my presentation. First, I wanted to share why I think it's important that the UN starts thinking more about borderlands. I think throughout the conference so far, we've heard a lot from academics who focus on this topic, and I want to share just some very initial thoughts why I think in the UN we should be looking at borderlands more. Then I wanted to share just very initial observations from the work, two projects that we're doing in borderlands related to peace and security. And finally, I will focus on challenges and opportunities when we are indeed working on borderlands and cross-border projects. So I think one of the things I want to really emphasize is, the UN system right now has entered something that we refer to as the decade of action. That means we're 10 years away from achieving the Agenda 2030. And in UNDP, like many of our sister entities, we've been really thinking about where are the geographic areas, where are the populations that we're worried about that they will be left furthest behind. And one of the observations I want to share is we feel that one of these geographic areas and one of these sets of populations is based in African borderlands. And we've done two recent studies. One is called Scaling Fences. This is a report where we've interviewed 1,970 African migrants who came to Europe through irregular channels. And we asked them what motivated them to understand why they made this perilous journey. And we noted a lot of these migrants came from African borderlands. In a similar study we did, which is called Journey to Extremism, we interviewed 495 voluntary recruits for extremist organizations across Africa. And what many of them had in common is that they were frustrated and felt marginalized, but really a lot of them lived in African borderlands. And that really put an emphasis in UNDP to say we need to better understand what is going on in African borderlands, and we should have dedicated research and programming to this. Our definition is a very broad and simple one. Borderlands are simply territories that are close to international borders. And I think we can have seen throughout this conference, they can operate quite differently, politically, socially, economically from the center and state capitals. I think Paul Nugent in the session before us, he pointed out some capitals are in border areas. So of course, what I'm sharing here is generalizations. But the other thing, and that's really important, is borderlands have often a lot in common with borderlands in other countries. And this is where I think some of the things I will be pointing to today are really about cross-border and sub-regional programming in collaboration. And we have a broad definition, yes, but it really means there is over 250 million people across Africa who live in what we would consider borderlands. And of course, across Africa, we see still a significant population increase, but nowhere more so than in borderlands. So if we are worried that populations living in borderlands are at risk of leaving left behind, we have 250 million people living there and the population is growing. This is a very clear indication that we need to have a dedicated focus and better understanding of borderlands. And the next 2 points are a bit of a generalization, but we see in many of these borderlands is that they are not connected well to the center, that national revenues are not being spent in these borderlands, that they're underserved in terms of basic services, that they're underserved in terms of security provision, especially by national police and security forces. And that as a result of this and interrelated to this, we see higher prevalence of extreme poverty in these areas. And as I mentioned earlier, this is where we see the risk of these areas being left behind. I'll come a little bit to climate change in a moment, but also when it comes to COVID-19, if your livelihoods depend on borders and borders are closed, for example, through the global pandemic, this can have a significant impact on your socioeconomic well-being. So I've just made a bit of a case why we feel at UNDP we should be doing much more on borderlands, but we've heard throughout the conference there's a lot of focus in academia, but really in the UN system, we have never really talked about borderlands and very little. Yes, there's work ongoing, but not often categorized and understood as borderlands work. And we feel there's a data gap. So not just the administrative data that can be difficult in the periphery. What I mean here is that the UN has never really disaggregated for borderlands, has not even mapped adequately what are the borderlands in Africa. And we have a research and policy gap. There's very little dedicated research on borderlands dynamics. And resulting of that is also a limited amount of programming. I'll show in the next slide, there's an increasing amount of cross-border and sub-regional programming in Borderlands, and we see this is a growth area, but still it is, compared to the broad range of UN programming, still small. And one of these reasons is we tend to think like states in the UN system, and a lot of times the locus of intervention really is national. Not just national, it's about the center. We work on national development plans, we have a UN Sustainable Development Corporation framework at the national level, and it's difficult for us to move beyond this very center-focused thinking and say, how can we work more across borders? How can we think sub-regional? And how can we move away from primarily working with ministries and government at the center to have a more better understanding and more nuanced approach to the periphery or to borderlands? And this is where we feel at UNDP what is really needed in international development, but also for, and specifically for the UN, is a more dedicated borderlands approach, a specific lens to say we need to understand the dynamics of communities in borderlands and really start looking beyond the center. And often this can be done through cross-border approaches. Now in UNDP, we've had in the last 2 years over 30 cross-border projects. We've started looking at some of the lessons learned from them, but there's two in particularly that I want to have a quick look at. And that is one project together with UNEP, Celia, you will likely know it very well, is the project we do in Somalia, Kenya, and Ethiopia. And the other is work on stabilization, the regional stabilization facility work that we do in the Lake Chad Basin, Niger, Chad, Nigeria, and Cameroon. One of these projects in the Horn is done in partnership with IGAD, while the work we do in the Lake Chad Basin is done with the LCBC. And I'll flag that in a second, the importance of regional economic communities. So there's two things that and these are of course very general observations that we have seen in terms of dynamics related to peace and security in borderlands based on these case studies. And one is that really poverty is both a cause and an effect of the conflict. And while that seems, quite obvious, I think it's very important and has clear implications for our response. It means we need multidimensional programming. You can't just do peace building or stabilization or social cohesion work in the absence of identifying socio-economic opportunities for these regions. And similarly, we can't just focus on humanitarian or development interventions when there is a security vacuum. And this doesn't only mean multidimensional programming, what it really means is a multi-partner approach across the UN, bringing our various competitive advantages to bear. And what we've seen, especially also in the Journey to Extremism study, is there is a very strong sense of exclusion and marginalization. And I'm emphasizing sense. This may not always be based on reality in terms of resources spent in these areas, but there is a sense of marginalization. And this can really lead to resentment and also rejection of formal government institutions, which makes it difficult if you are undertaking state building exercises in borderlands when they're not welcome. And particularly for young people, and this is again what the Journey Extremism report found, is young people living in borderlands feel the most marginalized and the most removed from economic and socioeconomic opportunities. And yes, I'm generalizing, but in many places, this has created a fertile ground for the recruitment into violent extremism groups. And if our work around PVE wants to find these hotspots where we see recruitment patterns, African borderlands and youth marginalizations are one area to consider. The other thing is we see often weak and predatory state security force. And I'm putting it in quotation marks. This is from an evaluation, and it's a sensitive topic. But what we found is we can't just say we need more state presence when sometimes state security apparatus is either seen or de facto part of the challenge in those areas. Often security personnel is recruited from other areas in the continent, and the local population rejects this presence. So if we are doing stabilization work and peace building work that requires strengthening of security forces, we need to be very sensitive to where are these police and soldiers coming from. And the last is really a trend we see in the work around climate security is really emphasizing the need to better understand these dynamics. Is a lot of these borderlands areas, especially where we see transhumans, where we have farmer and herder communities interact across borders. If climate change will lead to more water scarcity, to more resource scarcity, especially Borderlands, could see more conflict as a result. I'm coming to my last slide, Isabel, so you know where we are in timing. And this is just observations and a little bit of the opportunities and challenges of what we have seen across projects that we're currently operating in Borderlands and cross borders. And the first thing, and this is specifically to UNDP, limited presence on the ground. This is a huge challenge. As I said, we focus a lot on capital cities. Countries can be very large. We have small country offices. We can't be everywhere, but we're often not in Borderlands. And that means if we do start working there, we need to plan. It means it might take a year or two until our field offices are even operational, until we have capacity there. And this is why I really want to emphasize how joint UN approaches are very important. WFP, UNHCR, IOM, there are UN entities that tend to be much more present in Borderlands than, for example, UNDP. So we really need to collaborate as we're working on Borderlands. The other thing is we need to be honest and really say NGOs, and this is in the recent evaluation we've done in Ethiopia, Kenya, and Somalia, they tend to deliver better in many contexts just because they are on the ground. They have been on the ground. They have the network. And we therefore should really build on their comparative advantages in partnership when it comes to delivery and support to Borderlands regions. The other thing, and this is one of the reasons I think that we haven't done more of cross-border and sub-regional and Borderlands programming, is our donor partners are not structured any different than us. They have country offices. And yes, the EU and others are starting to think more at a sub-regional level, but they're often not there yet. And even if there's individuals who drive a sub-regional agenda, what we've seen in these projects that we're looking at in Lake Chad, in the Horn, is the transaction costs are huge for project implementers because we have to deal with many donor partners. We have high transaction costs, many partners involved, and the work we're doing, I wouldn't say we're driving blind, but we have too little data to really be able to inform our programming with data. It is very sensitive and political to work in Borderlands because you're working both with local and national governments, and we need to be very mindful of that. It's not just a technical intervention, it is inherently a political engagement, and we need to have a political accompanying strategy for our cross-border work from day one. Regional economic partners, the LCBC, IGAD, I mentioned them earlier, they're absolutely critical, but we also need to avoid that we say, oh, the government is on board, I talk to the regs. They are separate entities. The national governments need to be on board as much as we need regional economic community partners. And the last point, and I think maybe Marcelo, you'll speak a little bit also about tourism, but one area we see at UNDP that is really an opportunity for socio-economic growth and hopefully therefore also a security improvement in Borderlands is cross-border trade. And to really embrace the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement as an opportunity to help Borderlands really tap into their greatest resource, their proximity to other markets across the border. Let me end here, Isabel, and hand it back to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Christopher. I think that was very interesting and comprehensive, and I couldn't agree more that you need a lot of stakeholders, both at national level and also regional entities, because for them it's often much easier to address border issues by bringing different countries together. So thank you so much for that. I would like to now give the floor to Celia Halle, my colleague from UNEP. Welcome, Celia. Celia manages the UNEP EU Climate Change and Security Program, has been working on environment and peace and security issues for a long time with UNEP. And also, I think that's really interesting, and I hope it comes out in her presentation, has done quite a significant amount of work on gender and natural resources and the peace nexus. So Celia, please, you have the floor, and we're looking forward to your experience. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much, Isabel. And good evening, good afternoon, and good morning to everyone from very rainy and gray Geneva today. So moving on from Chris's brilliant presentation, which really set the scene, I think, so effectively on challenges facing Borderlands. Mine will be a bit more thematic and really looking at opportunities for Borderlands from working on challenges related to the environment and climate change in our quest in these last 10 years hopefully moving closer to achieving the SDGs. So just to set the scene, the UN Environment Programme has been working on the theme of this conference, the nexus of environment, development, and peace, for over 2 decades now. So I work for the Crisis Management Branch, which specifically seeks to support countries to address the environmental impacts of conflict and insecurity, but also, and crucially, to use the environment and natural resources as a platform for cooperation for development and peace. So in this presentation, I'll try very briefly to, I'm sorry, my screen isn't moving. Apologies for that. Oh. Here we go. Okay. So in this presentation, I'll start by very quickly reviewing why the environment and natural resources are particularly interesting and valuable points for cooperation and peace across borders and other kinds of divides. I'll very briefly review 3 categories of interventions, types of interventions that UNEP is involved in that relate or are relevant to work on peace building in the borderlands. And I'll end by hopefully discussing a few key lessons learned and recommendations, many of which are very close to some of what Christopher was mentioning just now, but recommendations for scaling these interventions to help countries and regions achieve the SDGs. So first of all, let's start with why the environment and natural resources are particularly interesting entry points for cooperation and therefore for programming in borderland areas, and look at kind of five key characteristics. First of all, natural resources environment obviously imply a shared dependence by multiple groups, and this shared dependence on resources such as water obviously creates strong incentives to find solutions for benefit sharing. The second rather obvious point is that environmental and climate issues famously do not stop at national or regional borders. This is now all the more evident as the world grapples with the global impacts of climate change. But as such, natural resources create possibilities for transnational cooperation to address these shared impacts and dependencies. The third point is that the exploitation and restoration of natural resources requires a kind of a long-term perspective and stability. Quick fixes for these issues very rarely exist, and this need for stability and predictability can incentivize stakeholder relationships and trust building. Fourth, natural resources management typically requires cooperation at different levels and between different governmental, non-governmental, and civil society stakeholders. And this can lead to shared ownership. And then the final point is that these issues often have the possibility of offering non-political entry points, at least early on, and allow dialogue to start and build on smaller kind of technical issues. For example, data sharing and planning. So with this background, let me now kind of come in more detail to how UNEP supports countries, regions, and communities to achieve environmental security in borderlands and obviously elsewhere. As I mentioned in the outline, I'll focus on 3 main categories of intervention. The first is around data, risk analysis, and assessment. The second is around the support to diplomacy and mediation. And the third is around the integrated programming that Christopher was calling for as well in his presentation. And in doing so, I'll be looking at some of the challenges inherent to UN interventions in this space, as well as some of the opportunities. So starting with the first category around data, risk analysis, and assessments, a key role for UNEP is obviously in the provision and analysis of environmental and climate data to support development and peace-building programming. We've conducted environmental assessments in more than 30 crisis-affected countries and regions, working closely with local and national authorities to use that process to build relationships across divided lines. These kinds of assessments are evidently often conducted in borderland areas. Just this year, we completed an environmental assessment of the Gaza Strip, for example. But the example that's illustrated here is of an assessment that was conducted on either side of the border between Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And one of the focus areas of that assessment was the complex binational deforestation problem, which you can see so starkly illustrated in this photo showing the different levels of tree cover on either side of the border. And in this case, working with national entities in both countries to provide accurate environmental data and analysis was really the first step towards setting a common basis for negotiation and building up towards joint border management. Now, moving forward and taking into account not only the growing impacts of climate change and environmental degradation on peace and security, but also the new mandates for the UN system to address these issues more systematically, UNEP is looking to leverage the opportunities that are afforded by big data and artificial intelligence to support governments and UN teams on the ground to monitor environmental risks at different scales. We're developing a geospatial platform that's called Strata to help end users, which are national governments, local authorities, and UN country teams, to easily and rapidly identify hotspots where environmental and climate stresses are converging over time and space, to determine how these hotspots overlap with other structural socioeconomic risks and potentially drive fragility, migration, conflict, or maladaptation. And finally, obviously, to support programming of area-specific programming on risk reduction and resilience building measures with a focus on nature-based solutions. The second category of UNEP interventions is around supporting national and regional actors and as well as UN political missions and diplomatic functions to address peace and security challenges related to the environment more effectively. And really the challenge is that up to now, the UN has only taken limited steps to address these issues in crisis contexts. There are obviously many reasons for that: the lack of knowledge, lack of real-time data, lack of analytical capacity, lack of best practices, all of that. But to help change this dynamic, we're deploying field advisors to UN political missions to deliver environmental analysis and advisory services, and really to help convene stakeholders to build consensus and enhance transboundary environmental cooperation, especially in contexts where transboundary resource sharing mechanisms are really weak or absent. So a UNEP field advisor is currently deployed to Somalia, and another will be deployed in early 2021 to the Horn of Africa. And there are 7 other such advisors that are being deployed through the Climate Security Mechanism, which is a partnership of UNEP, UNDP, and DPPA to mission settings over the next 2 years. Finally, and this is the third category of intervention, we're developing and testing integrated programming responses that seek to simultaneously achieve conflict prevention, peace building, and environmental sustainability objectives on the ground. So for example, through the partnership that I manage with the European Union on climate change and security, we're working in Darfur, in Sudan, and in Nepal to develop good practices that will, or hopefully can then be taken up by other actors in the UN system and beyond. So in Darfur, where resource scarcity and the sharing of land and water are central to conflict dynamics, and of course the situation, as you all know, is complicated by borders with Libya and Chad and migration flows with South Sudan. This means building resilience, in particular for marginalized and excluded populations, by bringing together actions around climate adaptation with conflict prevention and resolution approaches that are based on cooperation around natural resources. So concretely, this means working to diversify and climate-proof livelihoods, working to strengthen relationships within communities, between communities, and between communities and local government through the joint management of climate-sensitive natural resources. And one example of that is, for example, working with competing livelihood groups, farmers and herders around the demarcation and management of livestock migration corridors or establishing joint water points. And it also means strengthening local conflict resolution mechanisms such as peace committees, for example, and making sure they have the capacities necessary to resolve disputes over natural resources. So to be clear, this is not rocket science. The goal is really rather to kind of strategically combine tried and tested development approaches, as particular those linked to livelihoods and resilience, with the opportunities that are afforded by natural resources for dialogue and cooperation. And then a key element of these projects is, of course, to develop and test the metrics to understand the security impacts of climate-related interventions, both in the narrow sense of conflict reduction and in the broader human security sense. So I'm coming to the end now, Isabel, just to say that this has been a really quick overview of a broad range of UNEP interventions on this nexus of environment, development, and peace. I'd like to try to offer 3 equally broad lessons and recommendations, and hopefully we'll be able to come back to some of this during the in-depth discussion. But the first is really that our experience confirms that natural resources and environmental issues provide this powerful, but really largely unexploited by peace and security actors, so the powerful platform for cooperation across borders and different forms of divides. But like any form of peace building, process is everything. It's key to start with relatively small, concrete, and technical issues. Again, data sharing and joint analysis is one such opportunity. It's also really important to note that different natural resources have different strengths and weaknesses in bringing people together. Water is very different than oil, for example. So not all resources have the same cooperation potential, and this is something to keep in mind. The second point is that environmental degradation and climate change are obviously growing in importance as drivers of conflict and insecurity, as many will no doubt note. But really neither regional, national, or local governments, in particular in the most vulnerable and crisis-affected states, nor the UN system are yet fully equipped to understand, predict, or manage these risks. So there's a clear need to continue to develop capacities and technology for integrated risk analysis and early warning. And we hope that a tool like Strata will help close that gap, but obviously far broader multi-stakeholder efforts are needed in this respect. And the final point is that some good practices, some good examples in integrated programming are available, but now they need to be massively scaled and accelerated to meet the challenges at hand. We really need to move from pilot projects to full-scale programming. And so there's some very encouraging signs from innovative partners like the UN Peacebuilding Fund, for example, that has taken, that has been a real risk taker in this area, and who are starting to apply these approaches, including at the transboundary cross-border level. But moving forward, this will require strong partnerships, and for the UN in particular, this means building stronger partnerships between agencies that have complementary mandates. And crucially, this also means improving and standardizing our metrics on the impact, and in particular, the peace and security impact of integrated approaches, which we're not very well cited on yet. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much for your attention, and then look forward to coming back to some of this in the discussion. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Celia. I think that was really punchy and to the point. Thanks for sharing that. And I couldn't agree more. My experience in the Great Lakes was also that natural resource and the fight over natural resource was both a root cause of conflict, but it was also an opportunity for countries coming together because in a way, everyone can benefit from the rich natural resources in some of the cross-border areas. So thank you so much for that. That was really, really inspiring. Now I would like to give the floor to my colleague from UNESCO, Kaori Kawakami. She is the chief of the Emergency Preparedness and Response Unit at UNESCO. Her task is to protect cultural heritage in times of crisis. And she has been in a very kind of hotspots of crisis recently doing that, for example, in Yemen and also in the Philippines. So please, Kaori, go ahead.
Thank you, Isabel. Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, everyone. My name is Kaori Kawakami, and I'm the Chief of Emergency Preparedness and Response Unit of UNESCO. I would like to talk about how culture is affected by conflict and how it can contribute to peace and development. Because when we say culture or heritage, not many people understand how they are related to issues such as conflict, peace building, and development. So just to give you a quick idea of what UNESCO is doing, UNESCO's mission is to contribute to the building of peace, the eradication of poverty, sustainable development, and intercultural dialogue through education, sciences, culture, communication, and information. UNESCO is actually the only UN agency with a specific mandate in culture. And in order to pursue this mission, UNESCO sets standards through various conventions that you can see on the screen, mobilize the international community, provides coordination and information sharing platforms, and builds capacity and provides policy advice to member states. By protecting culture and promoting cultural pluralism, we're not just trying to protect, sites. UNESCO actually contributes to protecting human rights, preventing conflicts and building peace, upholding international humanitarian law and security, enhancing resilience and building sustainability, fostering international cooperation and dialogue. So what is the relationship between culture and conflicts or peace building? How is culture affected by conflicts in the first place? In recent years, there is an unprecedented rise in the number of conflicts affecting culture. So these are the examples of cultural heritage sites affected by conflicts as collateral damage. As you can see on the screen, on the left-hand side, this is an example from Iraq, and on the right-hand side, it's an example of Yemen. These are other examples of collateral damage in the old city of Aleppo in Syria. So this is another example from Syria, Umayyad Mosque before bombardment, and this is after. Attacks on culture often occur as part of a wider plan against a targeted group, like culture cleansing. And culture and heritage can also be targeted and destroyed intentionally. There is a theory that argues that the destruction of cultural monuments are a way of hurting and breaking ties with the West. Western civilization holds these cultural monuments dear, whereas terrorist groups use them to show how Western values and their values are not alike. In Mali, for example, 14 mausoleums were destroyed in Timbuktu World Heritage Sites. So these are other examples of intentional destructions in Iraq. ISIL, Daesh promotes an extreme form of Wahhabism, and monuments and temples from the past civilizations are seen as promoting idolatry, which in their view justifies their destruction of cultural heritage. And during conflict times, culture and religion-based persecutions happen too. And cultural objects quite often become a victim of looting and illicit trafficking, which can be a source of financing terrorism. So this is another example from Palmyra in Syria before looting, and this is after. People are the bearers of culture. With the displacement of people, the exodus of artists and artisans occurs, intangible heritage will be lost and cultural diversity will also be lost. Now we have seen cases of culture being affected by conflicts. So now how can culture contribute to peace and development? First of all, culture can offer income generating and livelihood opportunities through cultural tourism, creative industries, including crafts, cinemas, literature, performing arts, and so on. And since culture and heritage are part of people's identity and history, it provides psychosocial healing for trauma. And by reconstructing and restoring heritage, we also restore memory and dignity. Culture can promote dialogue and reconciliation among people and communities through the protection of cultural heritage and diversity. So here are some examples of Borderlands cooperation through the protection of culture and heritage. So on the left-hand side of the screen, Stone Circles of Senegambia is a World Heritage Site of large groups of megalithic stone circles located in Senegal and Gambia. These countries work closely together to manage the heritage site and establish a strategic tourism plan for the promotion of the site. They are currently working together for the implementation of a project to strengthen the valorization of the stone circles. And another example of cooperation through culture is the cooperation among 16 countries for the nomination and management of the Silk Roads as a World Heritage Site. Since 2003, China and Central Asian countries started to cooperate to nominate sites related to the Silk Road as a World Heritage. Now the network of cooperation has expanded to cover 16 countries, including the Republic of Korea, and they established an international coordination committee. the committee meets regularly to discuss not only the preparation of the nomination of sites as a World Heritage, but also the conservation and management of the sites to ensure the coordination among all countries and to discuss a common tourism strategy. So what does UNESCO do to protect culture and promote cultural tourism in order to prevent conflicts, promote peace, and facilitate dialogue? We advocate the importance of the role of culture in conflict prevention, peace building, rehabilitation, and reconciliation through various means, including statements by the Director General and high-level meetings. We also work with member states offering policy advice. We also cooperate with various partners such as ICOMOS, ICROM, UNOSAT, ICC, ICRC, and OHCHR to develop interinstitutional cooperation and synergy with their work. And now, thanks to these efforts, the importance of culture is gradually recognized, and the destruction of cultural heritage and illicit trafficking are considered as a war crime. UNESCO also provides technical support to program implementation, such as urgent safeguarding interventions, inventories, and rapid assessment. We also monitor cultural heritage sites affected by conflicts in cooperation with UNOSAT using satellite imagery. UNESCO also develops manual on the protection of cultural heritage and provides training, not only for cultural professionals, but also for those who are working in other sectors, such as police, customs, military, and those working for first aid and humanitarian interventions. UNESCO also works for awareness raising and also mobilize resources through the Heritage Emergency Fund, which supports the protection of culture and the promotion of cultural pluralism in emergencies related to conflicts and disasters. So what are the challenges and opportunities of all these efforts and interventions? One of the biggest challenges is that there's still not enough recognition and understanding in general of the role of culture in conflict recovery, peace building, and development. So the potential of culture is not yet fully exploited. But this means that the culture can offer new opportunities in peace building that may have not been explored before. Another challenge, and hence also an opportunity, is the cooperation between culture sector and other sectors, such as humanitarian interventions and development. And by enhancing cooperation between sectors and creating more synergy, the potential of culture can be fully utilized and the impact maximized. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much to my colleague Kaori. That was really interesting and brings in a completely new dimension of culture. And I think it has been a lot in the news, of course, in the case of Iraq and Syria. So I think thank you so much for the analysis and for sharing these very concrete examples with us. Good. Now to our colleague, Dr. Amadou, Philippe de Andres, who is the UNODC regional representative for East Africa. He has worked for a lot of regional presences, not only in the African region, but also in Latin America, in West Africa. And I think a very interesting detail about him, he has worked for Samsung in South Korea. So I think he knows the country really well. So Dr. Amadou, please, we're looking forward to your presentation.
Can you see the presentation? Good afternoon.
Yes, we can.
Okay, very good. So good afternoon to everyone. My presentation, is excellent that I'm number 4 because the prior presentations are an excellent, first of all, I learned a lot. And secondly, are an excellent kind of introduction to what other UN agencies like the UN Office on Drugs and Crime can do. And the little difference between us and other UN agencies is that we do have a strong presence in the borders, be it sea borders, land borders, or also airport, okay? So I would like to focus a little bit on what UNODC does, never alone, with other UN agencies, in supporting member states in the fight against transnational organized crime, drug trafficking, and terrorism. Because we can make the point that, if we strengthen borders, of course, terrorism will disappear and transnational organized crime will disappear. It will not. We will strengthen cooperation and free trade, but transnational organized crime, drug trafficking, and terrorism right now, unfortunately, in a post-COVID-19 era, will be there. What are the kind of major areas of intervention of UNODC? We have three major areas of intervention, which I would like to call, for the purpose of this presentation, instruments. We have an analytical instrument, which is basically based on the transnational organized crime threat assessments we provide, and we work for about a year with member states. We have one every 3 years at the global level, and another once at the regional level every 2.5 to 3 years. These TOCTAs provide us with scenario analysis, and we produce them, I repeat, in cooperation with member states. Then we have the other big instrument, which is the normative standards. UNODC is the guardian of the 3 drug conventions, but also the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime and its 3 protocols, which give us the teeth to bite transnational organized crime. And UNODC is also the guardian of the UN Convention Against Corruption and the 19 Universal Instruments Against Terrorism. So normative standards meaning supporting member states to adapt normative standards, their legislations, once they have ratified the conventions, and then strengthen also their national capacities. And then I go to the third one, institutional optimization. It's not capacity building, it goes to the next level. We are trying to build for the last, I would say, 17 years, sustainable national capacities to fight drug trafficking, transnational organized crime, and counterterrorism by using what we call the joint interagency unit models. I will explain what it is. Based on that, we then try to support member states to create inter-regional cross-border cooperation models in air, sea, and land borders. And then we try to also support member states, interested member states, to create regional training hubs. So you see on your screen the result of the latest TOCTA, Transnational Organized Crime Threat Assessment. You see, for example, the flows of cocaine in green, going from the Andean region to North America, going through Central America, or to West and Central Europe. We are talking about more than 1,200 tons of cocaine every year, a huge, huge illicit market. But you can also see, for example, other flows. If you see the brown arrows going from Southern Africa, Eastern Africa, where I'm based, to Southeast Asia, and then to China and Japan, that's another huge, huge flow of illicit transnational organized crime. You also have counterfeit medicines. And right now, by the way, they are skyrocketing. What we call the counterfeit medicines or substandard medicines are skyrocketing, and their trade is skyrocketing during the COVID-19 pandemic, unfortunately. Now, if we should see the intersection between transnational organized crime and stability, what a coincidence. We see that wherever there is big drug trafficking flows, be it heroin from Afghanistan via the southern route, or through Southeast Europe to West Europe, or drug trafficking, or any kind of our piracy, for example, in the Horn of Africa, we see conflicts flourishing. And of course, because transnational organized crime, including terrorism, are behind the funding and the funding of the networks and the modus operandi of these networks. So we go to normative standards. What are the good news? All these conventions are not empty shells. For example, the 1988 Convention Against Illicit Trafficking in Narcotic Drugs is the first ever convention in the world that talks about follow the money trail, meaning block the accounts of transnational organized crime networks, block money laundering. And that's what we are doing by establishing and helping member states to establish state-of-the-art financial intelligence units that are also interlinked in a same region. For example, in East Africa, we are creating a network of financial intelligence units, basically profiling transnational organized crime and money flows from drug trafficking and other kinds of transnational organized crime. We have also the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime and its 3 protocols, including trafficking in persons and smuggling of migrants, and trafficking and manufacturing of small arms. And we take a look at Article 2A. We already have the definition of transnational organized crime group, which is a prime actor for instability and lack of cooperation between borders. But we also have really strong instruments in this convention, which is called the Palermo Convention, like special investigation techniques. Or we have also the structuring of the joint interagency units. With regards to the UN Convention Against Corruption, we also have very good news. And the good news are that in 2021, we all hope, inshallah, that Eritrea and Somalia will ratify this convention. If they do so, Africa will be the only continent in the world with fully universal ratification of the Anti-Corruption Convention, but also of the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime. And then we have the 19 universal instruments against terrorism. One of them is very, very strong, and is the 1999 Convention on Financing of Terrorism, because if we block the funding of terrorism, for example, Al-Shabaab gets $14 million from sugar trade from Brazil to this region every year. If we block these sources, then we will be really acting well and implementing this convention. Now, the third instrument is what we call the institution optimization. And I give you three scenarios with three kind of blueprint interventions of UNODC with other UN agencies. One of them is on wildlife crime. We have the assessment. So we take a look on the left-hand side of your screens of the modus operandi of these transnational organized crime networks working on wildlife crime. For example, on rhino horns, 62% of networks use air, but for ivory tusks, for example, 75% use maritime. So what do? We take a look at the market. Whenever a global market in a specific region, for example, ivory, on the right-hand side of your screens, ivory, the illicit financial flows of an income generation of ivory only in this region amounts to $570 million per year. So whenever the income goes beyond 100 million, it means that industry, that illicit industry will flourish, and we need to do something about it. And for example, rhino horn, it represents 390 million of benefits, illicit benefits, every year only in Africa. And this is basically an assessment done by UNODC, Interpol, the World Bank, World Customs Organization, and CITES. So, all these five very strong actors working together. This is the result of the analysis. What do we do then? We establish interagency units in all the blue dots that you are seeing, either led by UNODC and supported by Interpol and the World Customs Organization, or led by the World Customs Organization and supported by other actors. But these blue dots are interconnected as we speak, and we've been interconnecting them for the last 14 years. So there is a network. Another example of institutional optimization. We have a project called ERCOP, which is mainly funded by the European Union and also other partners like South Korea and Japan. And what we do is we identify with member states those airports with increasing inflow and transit of passengers and air cargo, and we established a 17 or 20-person unit with special intel capacities generated by Interpol, UNODC, and also the World Customs Organization, and we interconnect them. So what happens? Say that I'm a human trafficking network team leader, and I go every Thursday of the month via Amsterdam to Panama. So the minute I land, I am going to be questioned by the authorities, by the joint interagency unit that has been created. And this interagency unit has been cooperating with the one in Amsterdam and probably two other airports. We take a look also of suspected cargo, air cargo. And below of your screens, you see another example, which is the UNODC World Customs Organization-led Container Control Program. Very similar modus operandi. We help member states in those ports that are increasing the intake of containers, the establishment of a joint interagency unit. On the lower part of your screens at the right-hand side, you see all these green dots, green countries are the ones that are leading joint interagency units of the Container Control Program. And up there, this screen, you see the ERCOP units that have been created for the last 12 years in the countries that are manifested in light blue and also dark blue. The countries that are shown in green means that we have also established, we have gone beyond, and we have then helped them to establish a regional training center which trains and retrains these joint interagency units. I have to also say something. These interagency units go every 6 months through polygraph tests. We also go through polygraph tests with them. So we make sure that there is no collusion of transnational organized crime and drug traffickers in the units. And they are obviously connected with I-24/7 of Interpol and CENTCOM of the World Customs Organization. So the ERCOR project and the Container Control Program project, they are also interconnected and they work together. Now, some results. On the left-hand side of your screen, you see basically the very concrete results of the Global Container Control Program globally. For example, 37 tons of precursors chemicals just last year, 77 tons of cocaine, or for example, 1.5 tons of heroin. All right. So we're talking about disrupting illegal trafficking, and of course, supporting the legal trade. And on your right-hand side, you see some of the examples of these success stories in West Africa. In Benin, Ghana, Senegal, and Togo, for example, in terms of seizures of cocaine, 1.7 tons last year, or 48 tons of chemicals, or for example, 10 million packs of illicit cigarettes. So to sum it up, we have 3 different instruments: threat assessments, scenario analysis. Secondly, the normative standards, whereby the UN and UNODC support member states to implement these teeth, which are already there in the conventions. And then the institutional optimization. For example, the establishment of joint interagency units, the creation of regional networks of prosecutors and these joint interagency units to really strengthen cooperation in land, air, and sea borders, and then the creation of inter-regional cross-border cooperation models. What would I say as basically recommendations? Following a little bit what my other colleagues have mentioned, I think there is a lack of data. So I think we need to work on further strengthening of the data and the threat assessments in member states, and that member states also start exchanging these kind of assessments in the same regions. Secondly, I think that my colleague has mentioned that I have worked in Samsung. Yeah, I worked in Samsung back in 1991. And I have learned from Samsung and South Korea that UNODC and the UN development system needs to work more closely with what I would call the knowledge economies. And why? Because we are utilizing, for example, artificial intelligence in airports, or we are using satellite imagery to identify increase of drug trafficking flows in specific regions. And we need to also use, beyond what we are using, digital systems, digital solutions, blockchain solutions, and artificial intelligence from those jurisdictions that can really increase South-South cooperation, for example, South Korea. I will leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Amado. I think that was really great. And I think we have some people in the audience who ask about implementation and enforcement. I think that is a really, really good example. And I can testify, I've seen our colleagues working in the port of Mombasa, where they were actually kind of checking on illegal trafficking of gold and natural resources from the Congo. And I can really see, border officials and custom officials are really important in that work. So thank you so much for being so concrete and giving us such exciting examples. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Good. Now we come to, I think, a very interesting part of the discussion. Our colleague Marcello Notariani will talk a little bit about kind of views from the World Tourism Organization on sustainable tourism in border areas. I think this is a really, really interesting and positive, I think, point of view as well. And he has also worked, interestingly, with the GGGI in South Korea. That's the Global Green Cross Institute. So Marcello, yeah, I'm looking forward to your presentation. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Can you listen to me? Yes, I think there is... I have to see if...
we can hear you and we can see the presentation, yeah?
Yeah, you can see me? Okay. You can listen to me? Okay. Yes. So far, okay. Okay. Thank you very much. First of all, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, good morning, good evening from Madrid, from Spain. First of all, I would like to thank you, the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development, people from Herth and Cheorwon Municipality from the Republic of Korea to invite me to this important conference. I am here on behalf of the United Nations World Tourism Organization, that is the only United Nations agency that is dealing with the tourism. My name is Marcello Tarianni. I am from Italy, but I live and work here in Spain. So far in my presentation, I will like to highlight some important aspect about tourism, peace, sustainable development in the borderlands. So far, the importance of tourism borderlands are very evident because border regions are often suitable location for conservation area and wildlife refuges. Borders frequently follow natural landscape, providing pristine natural attraction and also cultural attraction. So an international boundary can add a unique element to the tourism destination. What is the linkages between peace, development, and environment to tourism? It's quite evident. Also, my colleagues in the other presentation, as I mentioned, tourism as an intersectoral sector in order to link all the aspects about environment, peace, and development. So visiting a new place and meeting its people and culture is a transformative aspect that defines tourism role as an agent of peace. It's important because it's the importance of tourism because connect, they have a dialogue and exchange between people from different countries and different mindset. They break down cultural barriers and promote the values of tolerance, mutual understanding, and respect. So far, we know the relation between environment and tourism because we know the coast, mountain, rivers, and forests are major tourism attraction for tourists. All tourism rely on natural resources of supply of food, clean water, and other ecosystem services that ultimately depend on biodiversity. And also biodiversity contribute significantly to the attractiveness and the quality of the destination, and therefore to their competitiveness. So an healthy environment is vital for tourism. After that, I would like to show also the relation between the development and tourism. Tourism, as we know, is one of the major sectors of the global economy. We know that representing 9% of the GDP, one of 11 jobs, it's referring to tourism. Tourism contribute to 1.3 US trillion in export and 6% of world export and 60% of export of developing countries. Tourism and it's shown as an effective driver of economic growth and developing destination area, but we have this kind of tourist dilemma that when I talk with my colleagues for environment, for culture, from the social aspect, that is how to sustainable capture benefits and minimize impacts. We have some situation that we call over tourism, that in my vision is the lack of tourism management of the destination. So from the tourism development, we shifted to the sustainable development of tourism. So what is the relation between tourism and the SDG? In particular, we know that the SDG, in particular SDG number 8, that about decent work and economic growth. The number 12, responsible consumption and production. And finally, the number 14, life below the water, are target and they target also tourism. But finally, I can conclude that tourism has a potential to contribute directly or indirectly to all the goals of the Sustainable Development Goals. And so sustainable tourism is firmly positioned in the 2030 agenda. About the project, I choose 3 projects because they are very important in my opinion. One project is already mentioned partially by my colleague because it's the Silk Road program. The Silk Road program is a program that is a collaborative platform between 35 member states from Europe, Middle East, Central Asia, and Asia and Pacific. And was also, there are member states from public and private tourist sector, so they affiliate member of UNWTO. The main Silk Road goals and working area are raise the tourist potential of Silk Road heritage with the participating countries, improve tourist cooperation and exchange among member states, establish the Silk Road as a seamless, sustainable and consumptive transnational tourism route. We have the creation of knowledge on the Silk Road. And finally, but important, they are the last 2 points, the development strategy that include also marketing and promotion and capacity building initiative. And finally, last but not least, the mobilization of investment and stakeholders. The activities specifically in the Borderlands, we have a component that called Western Silk Road Tourism Initiative that was made together with the UNESCO with the support of the European Union. The aim is to identify Silk Road heritage available. They create a network of Silk Road University. There is working groups that coordinate common tourist activity and projects, use the concept to further diversify and reach the tourist potential of participating countries. And finally, we have this Silk Road Heritage Corridors tourist strategy that focuses on 2 heritage corridors crossing 5 countries like China, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan. We can mention also the 21st century maritime Silk Road, the overall impact of this maritime Silk Road on tourism, and assess the tourist potential of maritime Silk Road thematic routes across Asia and beyond. The result was a report that UNWTO made last year and showed that cruise tourism targeted investment in decade marine infrastructure, reutilization of ancient port city can reinvigorate available heritage, support local community, and diversify a country tourist sector. The second project is a network of cross-border national parks and protected area in West Africa. The country that involved in this project were Benin, Burkina Faso, Gambia, Guinea-Bissau, Mali, Mauritania, Niger, Senegal, and Sierra Leone. This project started in 2008 and finalized in May 2011. The party entities was the Islamic Conference Organization, the Korean International Cooperation Agency, and the source of funding was the STEP Foundation, the Sustainable Tourism Eradication Poverty Foundation, and the Korean International Cooperation Agency with the support of executive agency of UNWTO with ICO and COICA. The main project outputs, deliverable were different. We can mention some of them like comparative database in each country or products related and launched regional and international markets, cross-border trails and circuit like itineraries, facilities, guides, ancillary activity, networks, signage, and interpretation. But I would like to say at least three other objectives that are sustainable diversity, biodiversity management, or activity that provide stimulus of local community development, so the development and renovation of core infrastructure, provision of goods and services to tourism, And finally, revenue generating activity contributed to the reduction of poverty among community in and around the protected areas. So we have a craft production, local produce, job and education. So you understand very well the connection that there is between tourism sector to the other sector like environment and culture. And of course, the economic development. The other project that I would like to introduce is the Great Himalaya Trail. I know a little bit better this project because partially I was involved in this project. It's a long distance walking trail development and marketing from a network of existing trail, cover 1,700 700 kilometers in 10 sections in Nepal. So you can see the line between the border between Nepal and China. In particular, 2 years pilot stage into district, then expanded to the whole area in 2011. Another thing is important, targeting 5 districts, remote that include the remote mountain villages, community, cultural diversity, many historical and religious monuments and characteristic of the particular culture of each area. And we have a high and specialist biodiversity and high incidence of poverty. So far, within tourism, tracking has the stronger potential to directly benefit the poor in relative remote parts of the country. It's important because we develop a new trail section, bridge and trail upgrading, also shelter, sign, multi-use visitor center toilets, water and water treatment system, small-scale lodge and tea house and campsite. Important things is the value chain and the strategic tourism action plan and research-based marketing strategy. And finally, it's important the capacity building and basic tourist training packages for micro, small, and medium enterprise training program. The instigator and governance of this project was SNV, that is the Dutch Corporation, the STEP Foundation, and the UNWTO. A range of national and international bodies are behind of the full program. The program was financed by UKID, DFID, within implementation facilitated supported by SNV. It was a clear governance structure and the implementation to a working committee supported by professionals with specialist expertise. About the project outcome, we have to see that there were an increase of an income of 1,072 small enterprise by 1.21 million US dollar, create 2,251 jobs equivalents, improve the marketing and promotion of the Great Himalaya Trail, improve the ability of partners to plan, develop and manage tourism, tourist business along trail now market oriented, and finally improve the social and environmental income into the 5 target districts. What was the main lesson learned of this project? Pilot project can be very helpful at showing the way. So need carefully initial research, analysis and strategic and assessment, including marketing and competitor analysis. Cater for range of market interests, help to maximize opportunity and minimize risk. Use a dual approach of growing the market through a strong promotional activity as well as market-related product development. Work closely with domestic and international tourism operator, good route to market, and focusing on minimizing environmental impact in remote areas, and helping raise awareness and environmental value and need for conserving biodiversity. And finally, use existing sustainable tourist best practice schemes. What are the transboundary approach to tourism that I would like to show a little bit? First of all, engagement. So bring all stakeholders together to negotiate sharing benefits from independent resources such as transboundary water, for example. improve land tenure, referring to security, clear permissible uses, recognize traditional knowledge, for example, soil, water conservation, or intangible cultural heritage. Address resource conflict, so use multi-level environmental development cooperation. And finally, important to have an integrated approach. So combine market understanding, product development, capacity building, market growth, and destination management. The lesson learned and challenge, there are some that are very important. I think key to managing and promoting heritage in transboundary site is agree on common principle, recognize heritage site roots in the landscape, especially transboundary roots, and develop a common understanding of significance of these places, strengthening management of the heritage site, promoting appropriate behavior of key stakeholders, and increasing the quality of visitor experience, promote livelihood opportunities for local people in the landscape from heritage tourism, and finally, develop mutual beneficial partnership and platform to benefit heritage and tourism. So between this dualism on conservation and development. The challenges for tourism in Borderlands are different, but I can mention only 4 that are border regulation and visa. Still, we have a problem to get the visa easily. So this is a problem that it's much more at the political level. Lack of strategic planning, regional planning, weakness of the private sector and the civil society, language barrier and lack of communication between the borders, and the opportunity ahead. So transboundary opportunity for people to experience nature and enjoy the landscape should be developed through a coordinated visitor management system, visitor facility and trail routes, transboundary public transport system, and develop also a sustainable transboundary tourism initiative. Initiatives could cover the contribution of tourism to regional development, support of connected protected areas or conservation area for marketing of local ecological products, and develop and implementing visitor interpretation center and tourism info center. I would like to finalize with the final thought that I really love. It's from Leo Burner. They say the borders are not natural. They were created by people. Therefore, people should also be able to break them down for our culture and natural heritage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marcello. You made us dream a little bit about sustainable tourism, and because we are all kind of not able to go very far at in these times. I also like your idea about, the visa issues, and I like to say that in East Africa, the East African countries have been able to issue a joint visa for tourism who come to East Africa. So I think there are some encouraging examples in the East African regions on that. Thank you very much for sharing that. And then last but not least, Abigail, who joined us at very early hours from New York. Thank you so much, Abigail, for making that extra effort. Abigail, she works for the UN Mine Action Strategy. She is the chief, basically, of everything: policy, advocacy, public information, and resource mobilization. That sounds like a lot to me, Abigail. And she really has long-standing on-the-ground experience on mine action. She has worked in Afghanistan, in Sudan, in Sri Lanka. So Abigail, you have a really rich on-the-ground experience, and we're looking forward to hearing from you. Thank you. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Isabel. I would like to be the chief of everything, but there are a few other chiefs as well. Good day to everybody. I'm speaking from New York, as Isabel said, so I'm wishing you good morning, afternoon, and evening all over the world. I'm really pleased to be here today, and I would like to thank you for the invitation. So for Borderlands in conflict or post-conflict situations, mine action is actually an enabler of all the interventions that we've heard of today. We are small, we have a small niche focus, but we have a very, very large reach. And I just draw from my experience in Afghanistan. We worked with UNESCO clearing mines from the Bamyan cultural site so that UNESCO could develop and repair it. We work with ODC on weapons flow. And also in Afghanistan, I worked on a project with UNEP where they were planting trees to stop soil erosion in areas that we had cleared mines from. So really to just say that we're an integrated, it's good to see the UN in demonstrating integration like we are all with my colleagues today on the panel. So with that, I'll begin. I'm going to speak about the impact of explosive hazard contamination globally, the UN response, and a number of case studies from various borderlands. So just to give you an overview of the impact of conflict, basically, and the weapons and explosive remnants of war that are left behind. Despite concerted efforts and significant progress, including the Mine Ban Convention now has 164 signatories, 66 states today remain contaminated by explosive remnants of war, including mines. There has been a steady decline in casualty numbers in the early 2000s, but since then, high numbers of casualties have been recorded in the last 5 years. And this is basically as a result of countries that are facing intense conflict, I name Iraq and Syria and Afghanistan, and also the large-scale use of IEDs, which are improvised explosive devices. In the times of Afghanistan, they first became known as roadside bombs. I'm sure lots of people heard of those. But basically, these are homemade devices, and they're extremely dangerous and claim many, many victims. So just to talk about the accidents, the UN is present in 29 countries that have a explosive remnant of war problem. And in those countries, accidents and casualties rose from 13,500 in 2018 to almost 16,000 in 2019. And of course, we're gathering data for 2020, but given the situation, I'm sure we will see a continued rise in those. Improvised explosive devices cause the majority of those accidents. So what is the UN doing about this? So you may or may not know, but UNMAS is located in the Department of Peace Operations. But despite that location in that one entity, we are mandated by the General Assembly to coordinate mine action across the entire UN system. So we support both peace operations and also humanitarian interventions. So we're a small team in New York, which I'm not the chief of all of them. We have a humanitarian hub in Geneva, and then we have about 3,000 people, men and women, employed throughout 19 UNMAS programs in the field. And mine action encompasses, we talk about the 5 pillars of mine action. So this is clearance of mines and explosive hazards, providing risk education to teach people how to live more safely. We have victim assistance programs, advocacy, again, like my colleagues have mentioned, through treaty meetings, through statements and so on. And then also stockpile destruction, which is destroying stockpiles of weapons that could be used later. So I'm now going to talk about how mine action enables peace building. And this has definitely been the case in borderland situations, including some of my own personal experience that I'll share. So mine action has a very visible and an immediate impact on conflict situations. So it's often a very good entry point for peace building activities. So it can be a topic of discussion during peace negotiations, because very often both sides of the conflict have civilians who are impacted the same. A landmine or a cluster munition doesn't know who's picking it up or who's standing on it. So these kind of contamination impacts both sides, and it's a point of congruence where both sides can see the same benefit in having clearance. And I would just say from my own experience in Sudan in 2002, 2002, we were working with both sides from the SPLM and the government of Sudan, combatants who came together in a borderland area in the Nuba Mountains to develop mine action teams that had members from both sides, and it was a really amazing thing a long time ago in my career. So mine action is a good confidence building at the local level, and it enables people to return home, gain confidence in the peace process, start basically going back to a normal life. And also the improvements in safety and overall safety and security fosters good relations between local populations and governments, again, strengthening the peace process. And clearance of explosive ordnance and weapons and ammunition also, through destroying stockpiles of these, helps prevent further conflict because we curb illicit access or transfer of weapons. And then, of course, mine action enables humanitarian and development objectives, clearing land and opening roads, freedom of movement, including for peacekeepers and humanitarian workers, and also socio-economic delivery, enabling agricultural fields to be replanted, markets to open. Looking at some of those pictures from Iraq, from our UNESCO colleague, also clearing bombs from all of that rubble, you know, is an important step on the road to recovery. So just to talk about a couple of examples, I'd like to give you a few case studies, starting with Colombia. So during the peace negotiations in Colombia, mine action was included in the 2016 peace accord between the government and the FARC. The strong part of the peace process was all about rural development and land reform. It was a central part of the process and of the agreement, and information about where contamination from mines was an essential part of the negotiations and to implement the peace accord. And in addition, there were many FARC ex-combatants who had been trained in mine action activities. To date, in an UNMAS program, there's only over 100 former fighters have been retrained, and they support socioeconomic reintegration in their own communities and they see the dividends of that peace process and strengthens overall belief in the peace process. And UNMAS work in Colombia is ongoing. Another example that I'd like to give you comes from Europe, from Cyprus, where demining was a concrete offering to relaunch the dialogue between Greek Cypriot and Turkish Cypriot leaders during the final agreement in 2015. So there were a number of minefields that blocked crossing points, and by clearing some of those minefields, we were able to increase the number of crossing points that were open, which of course enabled people to travel through these border zones, through this borderland, to visit family and friends and engage in trade and really start to knit those communities together. In Cyprus, UNMAS also provides technical advice to the Committee on Missing Persons to facilitate safe access to places where maybe there are missing persons, which of course contributes to reconciliation between communities, and relatives have closure over the grief that they faced previously. In Sudan, moving on to Sudan, I was mentioning before I worked there a long time ago. Since then, also in Sudan's eastern states, there was extensive conflict until 2006 between the SPLM and the government of Sudan, when the Eastern Sudan Peace Agreement was signed. And you could argue that the continued peace has been attributed in part to the opportunities that were granted due to mine action and clearance efforts. So the removal of mines and explosive remnants of war facilitated dialogue between conflicting tribes and increased economic recovery, including there was in Abyei, the market in Amiet was reopened, which was essential to the local community. And the government of Sudan themselves have acknowledged the contribution of mine action to peace processes in various meetings, including intersessional meetings of the Mine Ban Treaty. So UNMAS is currently exploring, in terms of sort of lessons learned and replicating this success in South Kordofan and Blue Nile states, where conflict is currently and unfortunately ongoing. My final slide just brings a couple of examples from the ASEAN region. So Cambodia has a long border with Thailand that is heavily mined for 740 kilometers of that border area. And in Cambodia, mines have killed over 64,000 Cambodians. UNDP, with whom UNMAS works closely with, supports Cambodia in terms of rehabilitation, vocational training, and contributing to reconciliation and sustained peace for victims of mines in Cambodia. All of my case studies seem to begin with C, forgive me. So Cambodia, so far they've cleared 16,000 square kilometers of contaminated land, and over 3,000 survivors have received assistance. And Cambodia's focus on this is demonstrating a commitment to upholding the peace there and showing effective governance, therefore building confidence in those communities. In Myanmar, I'll also speak very briefly about Myanmar. Myanmar Mine Action is also contributing to local conflict resolution at the local level, despite ongoing armed conflict and other challenges to peace in the country at large. So UNICEF there, again, another of UNMAS's strong partners in Mine Action, has assisted in setting up, they're called mine risk working groups at national and state level, and they include government ministries, including the National Army and also NGOs. Actually, just to make an aside point here, in my experience in Sri Lanka, Sudan and Afghanistan, it's been very interesting to see how Mine Action very often includes the army of the countries that we're working in. And because of that, I do think that we offer an opportunity in peace building to really find a common point between military and civilian actors, which I have seen has really brought, positive change to peace building. So anyway, back to the mine risk working group. So they present a really unique and valuable opportunity for advocacy and engagement on protection. Of course, UNICEF particularly are interested in protection of children and the peace processes generally. So to conclude, there's no doubt that Mine Action plays a key role in promoting peace, including in Borderlands. And I will just conclude with the message of all of our Secretary General, our boss. He's the real chief. Antonio Guterres said that peace without Mine Action is incomplete peace. And I leave with that. Thank you very much, Isabel.
Thank you very much, Abigail, and thanks for making this special effort to get up so early to be with us. Great. So I think this was a really interesting round of presentations. Thanks, colleagues. I really can relate to that. And I'm impressed also that your examples are all very concrete. They're from concrete places with concrete initiatives. And I think that makes it much more visible to the audience what the UN is actually doing and within which frameworks. We already got a few questions that you can find in the question and answers. And I would like to start with a number of them because we only have 25 minutes left. So what I would like to do is kind of give you 4 questions that we got from the Q&A and also from a previous question that we received, and then ask each of you to answer whichever one is either directed to you or which you would like to answer. Yeah. So the questions are the following. The first 3 are the ones that you can find in the question and answers. So the first one from the floor is, there seems to be an affinity between the work of UNESCO and the World Tourism Organization. Is there any good partnership practice or collaboration between UNESCO and the World Tourism Organization, in particular in the context of Borderlands? So that's, I think, targeted at UNESCO and the World Tourism Organization. The second one is to Celia from UNEP is a little bit saying that she emphasized the importance of interagency partnerships and collaboration within the UN system. Is there any good practice in terms of interagency partnerships to deal with development, environment, and peace in Asia? And here I would like to kind of say, you know, opportunities and also challenges to interagency partnerships. That could be for all of you. And then we have a question from a participant from Korea to Marcello, saying thanks for the interesting presentation. He said that tourism in borderlands can be a driver for peace and sustainable development. Could you explain more about dark tourism sites and destinations in borderlands, such as war, peace memorials, natural disaster sites, etc.? And to this list, I would like to add a question from South Korea participant saying, you know, what are the links between the DEEPEN, the project that we're discussing here, and the Leaving No One Behind of the SDGs? And then a question from a participant from Nigeria who asked, you know, what can the UN do to ensure enforcement of strategies made beyond peace, climate, development in borderlands? So that's maybe, you know, Amadou and also Abigail could say something about that. So I think we have enough questions for you to answer. Could we now maybe start in the same order as the presentations to answer those questions? So Christopher, would you like to start?
I'll be happy to start off, and there wasn't really a direct question to me. So just a couple of quick observations. I think one thing I really highlighted is for Borderlands to work, we really need a UN-wide interagency approach. One of the aspects is the lack of presence of most of us. You know, as some of our entities are much smaller, some of us are usually more on the HQ and regional level, and some of us are really on the ground. And I think for us to make engagement in Borderlands more successful, we really need more of an interagency approach. And I think the second really also goes to data. I think, you know, a lot of the colleagues here have mentioned it, Amado, you've mentioned it, you know, we really need to start pooling our data. And the truth is at the moment, a lot of us are not thinking about a Borderlands lens. And that's an important change in conversation I think this conference is contributing to. We are working in Borderlands. A lot of local governance, multi-level governance work has for many years worked in the periphery. But now to start calling this concept Borderlands and to start, okay, we need a dedicated lens and we need dedicated data. I think this is a bit of a change in conversation, especially for the UN, less so for the academic participants we've had throughout this conference. So yes, interagency also really needs to go beyond just the presence. It really needs to look at data. I mean, the leaving no one behind, that was also in my presentation, I think really the impetus originally to say, borderland communities, there is a lot of economic potential, but in the context of Africa, we also see that these are the areas where we feel there's the biggest risk that these populations could be left behind. And unfortunate, because there is so much untapped economic potential if these economic corridors could be opened up, if you know you could invest in education and services and you utilize the youth in these areas. So we really hope that the conversation on leaving no one behind in the Agenda 2030 can have a more dedicated focus on borderlands, because we really feel that there's an urgent need there. But let me stop here and keep it short. Back to you, Isabel.
Thank you so much, Christopher. And please, participants who follow us on YouTube, feel free to also post, you know, more questions if you would like to. Okay, then please, after Christopher, we go on to Celia. Celia, there was a direct question to you on interagency, you know, collaboration.
There was. Thank you, Isabel, and thank you to everyone for these excellent presentations. It's really been an incredible tour d'horizon of all the incredibly complementary things that the UN is doing. I'm sorry. So there was a very direct question to me about best practices in interagency cooperation over these issues. I think it was specifically focused on Asia. I myself don't work very much in Asia. I focus much of my career on Africa. So I'll just say that there is an initiative starting now, which I believe is a UNEP DPPA, so the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, as well as DPO, interagency initiative that is starting in the Mekong Delta, which is around kind of reducing the environmental drivers of conflict in that region, and in particular around advancing environmental and climate risk assessments in support of conflict prevention and peace in the Mekong Delta. I can't speak very much about it, not only because I don't work on it myself directly, but also because it's just starting. I think they're in the process of finalizing the conceptualization of that initiative. But it's very encouraging to see these kinds of initiatives start to become far more common. I would like to give an example, though, and coming back, Isabel, you mentioned that I have been working on the gender dimensions of the environmental security nexus. So if I can just give a good example of interagency cooperation around the topic of gender, climate, and security. And this is a small pilot project that we collaborated on as UNEP with UNDP and UN Women in North Kordofan in Sudan. Building on UNDP's interventions on community stabilization in the border area with South Sudan. And I think this shows a good example of like the complementary opportunities of bringing different agencies together. So this was a small project that as I said, built on UNDP's initiative, which focuses on building livelihoods, alternative livelihoods in an area that has been heavily affected, obviously, by the impacts of climate change, and reducing the prevalence of small arms in the area. So we built on the livelihoods component, working specifically on targeting women, women from various livelihoods communities, women IDPs in the area, and really working on improving opportunities for income generation for women who were often left behind, but also on the front lines of the climate crisis. Combining that then with a UNEP-led component on environmental governance and environmental action planning, specifically targeting women as leaders of their communities on environmental action planning. And then UN Women coming in with a component on strengthening women's roles in conflict prevention and conflict resolution over natural resources in those communities. So this was really, again, building on existing work, but bringing in the added expertise of agencies that have specific mandates in other areas. It was a very successful project. I don't have time to detail the impact here, but just to say that this is one of the approaches that the Peace Building Fund has now adopted and is replicating, of course, adapting to a transboundary context between Mali and Niger, for example. So there's a project that is taking up that interagency approach and replicating it at a much greater scale. There are lots of challenges related to interagency cooperation. I don't know how much of the UN kitchen one should reveal here, but just to say that these things still remain grossly under-incentivized. It is still incredibly difficult to so much as share budgets between agencies. And some of these obstacles should really, we really need to pay more attention to some of these obstacles if we are to achieve integrated approaches and integrated programming more generally. And then just to, note again, I think the point that Christopher mentioned in some of the challenges that he had in his early slides around how siloed funding still is that we all depend on and work with. And that's one of the greater challenges that we have in particular been working with member states on, is understanding how to better integrate financing streams so that we can in fact scale these kinds of integrated approaches. Thanks a lot.
Great, thank you so much, Silvia. I think that a lot of the challenges and opportunities that you mentioned, one that I saw a lot working in the Great Lakes on transborder issues was that, the countries who have a good country presence like FAO, UNDP, they often have a national mandate, whereas the regional offices are often non-residence agencies like UNEP, for example, who have a regional transborder mandate, but then have no presence on the ground. So I think that is also like a major challenge that I've seen when working on transborder issues. Yeah, just to add to that. Great. I would like now to ask both Kaori and Marcello to answer a little bit that question on, are there some concrete examples of collaboration between the World Tourism Organization and UNESCO when it comes to the protection of cultural heritage?
Sure. Thank you very much for this question. Yes, definitely, there is a good partnership and cooperation between UNESCO and UNWTO. Personally, I'm not involved in the issue of tourism, so I don't have good examples, but I know from the work that is done by other colleagues. For example, UNESCO and UNWTO are working together for this issue of the Silk Road. And as you can imagine, World Heritage Sites, which can be both cultural and natural sites, are such popular tourism destinations. So culture or natural sites are part of tourism, and tourism is also, the issue of tourism is naturally a part of the issue of culture. So definitely we work closely together, and maybe Marcello can give us more concrete examples of our collaboration. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kaori, and thank you for the question. We already mentioned that the Silk Road program, it's a good example of cooperation between UNESCO and UNWTO. Indeed, I have seen many projects where the UN, UNESCO and UNWTO have worked together. Recently, I was involved in a project in Iran before COVID in order to enhance the capacity of the government to put in value and to better manage visitors in the UNESCO sites. In my presentation, I already pointed out the importance to have a management model, not only for the World Heritage Sites, but also for the natural sites. And this is important. I connect with what Christopher said before, that we need much more reliable and on-time data, not only to conserve to protect the heritage, but also for livelihood options for the communities. My point is that we can use tourism as a tool for having economic opportunity for the borderlands communities, and through this we can also highlight the value to conserve and to protect the heritage, both natural and cultural heritage. So if we can work together, I think we have a good opportunity to provide option to just over and pass the peace and start to cooperate better. The second question is related with dark tourism. Unless I never worked before on dark tourism, I think first we have to consider some things. We need a little bit of time to do this dark tourism because it's related with some disaster in terms of holocausts or other very bad memory. So, for example, I have a colleague that working in Rwanda, and they set up a museum for the genocides. But you need at least a little bit of time in order to work on this subject, because the community should be at least should have some space in terms to try to overcome the previous conflict and turn page. Finally, there is another thing that if I remember well, the question about key UN agency dealing with borderlands from Il Cheong. Frankly speaking, I think because of my experience that unless it's not a United Nations agency, we need also to involve IUCN, the International Union for Conservation, Natural Conservation, that is It's not a UN agency, but it's an agency that could help us specifically when we work with protected areas in the borderlands. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcello, and thank you, Kaori. I think this is a very concrete answers to the question. When I give now the floor to Amadou and to Abigail, could you, apart from the question of what kind of interagency collaboration have you found useful in your areas, also answer a little bit the question of enforcement, because your areas are both law and security related. So kind of best practices of where you're able to reinforce, please.
Thank you. So on the question of best practices of interagency cooperation, I would give very shortly two related to Sub-Saharan Africa. One of them is the EU-funded project called Better Migration for Management, which not only tries to tackle the irregular migration problem, but also facilitate regular migration. And this is a program whereby more than 7 different agencies and multilateral organizations have been cooperating. From the UN side, we are UNODC and IOM. And thanks to this cooperation, really, we have really reached very substantial results for the last 3 years in Eastern Africa. At the policy level, the UN directors in the region, we meet in different coalitions, what we call the opportunities and issues-based coalitions. And coalition number 6 focuses on peace, security, and the respect for human rights. UNODC, along with UNDP and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and UNOWA, the UN Office to the African Union, are co-leading this coalition of 17 different UN agencies, whereby we identify gaps and then we identify blue intervention projects for East, Southern, West, and Central Africa, including cross-border cooperation projects. In terms of law of enforcement, I would say, the conventions I was mentioning, they have teeth, but there is something called the review mechanism. For example, of the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime or the UN Convention Against Corruption. And this review mechanism puts UNODC as the secretary, but 2 member states review the different sections of how a third member state is implementing the conventions. We draw kind of like a flow chart and a gap analysis, and then the member state, basically our client, decides what kind of gaps they are going to be addressing first. For example, if there is a lack of regional cooperation, that would be one of the priorities for the next 3 years. But if there is a gap of, for example, of law enforcement cooperation in fighting transnational organized crime and terrorism, that could be gap number 2. And then UN agencies, including UNODC, decide how to best help member states to fill these gaps. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amadou. Abigail?
Thank you very much, Isabel. So I'd like to just talk about 2 interagency coordination mechanisms that are important for mine action. The first is the Interagency Coordination Group, which UNMAS chairs as requested by the General Assembly. And you'd noticed in my presentation, I was talking about UNICEF and UNDP. So the 3 agencies mainly within the UN that have mine action components in their work are UNICEF, UNDP and UNMAS. But the Interagency Coordination Group includes 12 UN entities who are kind of impacted and involved. So OCHA, of course, in humanitarian response, we have to consider mine action, UNHCR for return, again, making sure that routes for people to travel are safe. The Office of Disarmament Affairs are key in that. Their main focus is on the international treaties, which I will just mention in a moment, to do with enforcement. So there's very good coordination. We coordinate together so that we have one voice in various advocacy interventions at treaty meetings after particular, if there are use of banned weapons, cluster munitions were used in Yemen, we spoke about that together. And then also in actually practically on the ground in this very moment, probably later today, I'll be involved in a planning meeting for an interagency assessment of the Nagorno-Karabakh. And how mine action can contribute to that. Another interagency coordination mechanism is the Integrated IED Task Force. that's its name. This one is particularly interesting because, again, following the Secretary General's direction to us that we should break down silos, the IED task force really includes the whole gamut. We have counter-terrorism people there, ODC people there, UNICEF is there. Almost any entity that has a mandate to deal with IEDs in some way is on that team. And it's really interesting to see how we're working together, for example, recently in Yemen, and various management tools have been developed. So that's another interagency effort. At the local level, of course, the humanitarian response plans include many of the UN agencies in the humanitarian field, and Mine Action is incorporated there. And of course, for lots of us in terms of UN country team integrated planning. And all my colleagues on this table have probably sat in country teams and experienced those interagency efforts. In terms of enforcement, international humanitarian law, there's the Mine Ban Treaty, the Cluster Treaty, the CCW is the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, the Convention for the Rights of People with Disability. These are all frameworks that push and encourage adherence to, well, IHL that would reduce the impact of explosive weapons. And then I would just finally say there is a UNMAS chairs and promotes international mine action standards. So these are standards that all mine action operators implement to make sure that we're all clearing mines and delivering risk education. All of our activities are to the same standard in every country. So those are ways that we not enforce, moderate, anyway, organize the system. Thank you, Isabel. I hope that those were useful answers.
Thank you very much. We have 4 more minutes, and thank you so much. I think this was really an excellent panel, and I'm so happy to see, you know, my colleagues, all of you together in one panel. I just wanted to answer very briefly the last 2 questions that came in. One was, you know, are we missing out any colleagues or agencies that are vital for cross-border issues, and what can the UN do in the case of the 2 Koreas? I would say for the first question, I mean, from my own experience, I would add, you know, like regional mandates of the UN, for example, the Secretary General's office on the Great Lakes region based in Nairobi. They work a lot, of course, on transborder issues. UNOVAS for West Africa and the Sahel. They are very active in cross-border issues, questions of, you know, migration, peace and security, organized crime in the region, environmental issues. They're quite strong on that. And of course, you know, offices like the UN High Commissioner for Refugees on the question of returning populations after wars, you know, who come back crossing borders. IDPs also, who often kind of stay pushed in border areas, you know, and how to settle those. I think are all important topics where those agencies surely have an important mandate to contribute. In the case of Korea, I mean, we didn't have any examples here relating to Korea, interestingly enough, but I think sometimes it can help to start to work together also with the help of the UN on maybe less sensitive issues such as, you know, tourism, cultural sites, and the question of, you know, how can we protect the environment together, for example, work on water issues, environmental protection issues. So I think, yeah, I hope that there will be occasions, you know, where we can also discuss more in detail next time the situation of Korea. And I would like to thank all of the participants for, you know, their questions prior and during the session. I think it was a very good discussion, loads of concrete examples. And I would like to encourage all of you to fill in the survey that will be posted after the session on YouTube to give us some feedback on, you know, whether you enjoyed it, whether there are any remaining questions. And we hope that you will be able to follow as much as possible of the rest of this really, really interesting conference. So thank you to my colleagues from the UN, and thanks to the organizers, and have a good weekend to all. Bye.
Restful weekend to everybody. Thank you very much.
Okay, bye,
Thank
colleagues.
you very much.
Good
Thank you very
weekend.
much. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very much. I think that's it for session 6. A great big thanks to Isabel Kemp for moderating the session and excellent time management, I must say. And also to the 6 presenters for sharing your knowledge with us. I would also like to say thank you for doing good work around the world and also taking part in our forum today. That's it for day 2 of the conference. Tomorrow, we have 3 more sessions. It's the last day of the forum. Please do join us. We'll be starting at 10 a.m. Korea Standard Time, and we have 3 more sessions. So please do join us on the last day. Thank you very much for joining us, and a good night from South Korea.